Our guest today is Rick Atkinson, and he spent nearly 15 years working on his World War II trilogy and was a staff writer and senior editor at the Washington Post. He's the author of several fantastic books, including The Long Gray Line, Crusade, In the Company of Soldiers, and the best-selling Liberation trilogy, which included An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and The Guns at Last Light. He's also the winner of the Pulitzer Prizes for both history and journalism. He's also won many other awards, including the George Polk Award and the Pritzker Military Library Literature Award. And the book that we'll be speaking about today, The British Are Coming, is the winner of this year's George Washington Prize. So the book that we're talking about today, as I just mentioned, is the first in a new trilogy about the American Revolution, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. All right, I am going to stop sharing my screen right here. Mr. Atkinson, welcome. It's great to have you here on Book Breaks.
Thank you, William. Nice to be with you this afternoon, and good morning to everyone who's in the Central Mountain and Pacific time zones. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for that, for waking up early to join us.
Yeah.
All right, so this book, it's a big book, but it is a fantastic read. The best way I can describe reading it is it's almost cinematic in the way that you've written it. But can you tell us why you decided to write this new trilogy? What drew you to the American Revolution? And also, for the first book of the trilogy, why did you decide to end it in 1777 after the Battle of Princeton?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I spent almost 15 years writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And even before I finished that third and final volume, I was pondering what to do next. And the obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific and to do for that theater what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western European theaters in World War II. But that would have required me to start World War II all over again. And I just didn't have the heart for it. And I've always, since I was a kid, as many of our viewers have also, I'm sure, had a fascination with the American Revolution. And my premise was in part that finding out where we came from, who we were, what our forebears were willing to die for, which is the most profound question any people can ask themselves, would tell us not only about them, but it would tell us about us, who we have become, what we have achieved since then, and whether we have frankly fulfilled some of the ambitions that that revolutionary generation had. And I ended in 1777 with the two battles of Trenton and then the Battle of Princeton, partly because that's just a natural breaking point. They go into winter quarters, the Continental Army and the British go into winter quarters as they typically did in the 18th century. And so there'll be a long fallow period in which very little happens. And a lot has happened. I opened this book with King George in Britain, in King George III, our last king in Britain, in the summer of 1773. So there's a lot of ground to cover between then and the Battle of Princeton in January 1777. And my ambition in part is to tell the story from both sides. First, to tell it as a story. It's one of the greatest stories in Western civilization, but also so that we see what the British are seeing. We understand George III, I hope, as well as we understand George Washington or the leaders of the Continental Congress or other American patriot heroes. And we understand George's cabinet. We understand why the British are going to persist for 8 years in fighting a war across 3,000 miles of open ocean against their own people. And to do that, we really have to kind of get inside the British Empire. So that was my rationale for both beginning it and ending it where I ended it.
And that's actually perfect, because the next question I have is, what I really did enjoy in the book was that you included this British perspective. And I wanted to ask about the figure of King George, because In the musical Hamilton, he's almost presented as a semi-comedic figure. From the American perspective, he's this great tyrant. And in the 1990s, there was that movie, The Madness of King George. So he's always presented somewhat almost as a caricature. But the way you presented him in his book, he was like you made him kind of a whole person. And what I found really interesting was his dogged determination and his really direct involvement in the campaign against the rebellion. Can you tell us a little bit more about King George and the way you presented him?
Yeah, thank you. You're right. In Hamilton, he sings three songs. There's a wonderful comedic song, "You'll Be Back." And he's a fabulous character. In the original cast, of course, he's the only white actor playing in a cast of black actors. That's not the historical George. As much as I revere the musical Hamilton, that is not who George was. Now, George becomes king at the age of 22 in 1760 when his grandfather dies. His father has already died, and he will be king for 60 years. He is a formidable figure. He's got a broad set of interests. He's interested in everything from agronomy, they call him Farmer George, to horology, the study of time. He's very well read. His personal library of 60,000 books will become the foundation for the British Library. He is the man driving the train when it comes to making war on the American revolutionaries. He believes, and this is a premise widely shared by his cabinet and the entire British government and a good portion of the 12 million British people, he believes that if the American colonies are permitted to slip away, that the British Empire, which is a new construct in 1775 when the revolution begins, that the British Empire, which has really come together with British victory over the French and the Spanish in the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, which has brought to Britain with the peace in 1763 500 million fertile acres in North America. It's brought them Canada, it's brought them sugar islands from the West Indies, it's brought them parts of India. So the British Empire has come together. And he believes that if the American colonies are permitted to secede, that will be the end of the British Empire, that it will then be weakened, that its great power as a trading organization will be weakened, and that its enemies in Europe, particularly France, they've already fought 3 wars against France in the 18th century, and that France will fall on Britain and carve up what's left of the British Empire. He believes this in his bones. And I think understanding these, it's wrong, by the way, it's a strategic misconception, as we will see when the colonies break away and the British Empire it shrivels a bit, but then it comes back in earnest again, and the Second British Empire will be bigger and badder and better in many ways than the original. But he believes it, and the fact that he believes it is the reason that he is going to wage this bloody, costly war for as long as he does. Understanding that, understanding George, understanding his family. He marries an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte. They have 15 kids. He's a very good father. You see it in his correspondence. He's actually, as kings go, quite a good monarch. He cares about his people. He believes in the power of Parliament. He totally subscribes to the British system in which the crown shares power with Parliament. So I think caricaturing him, and you're right, he is often a caricature, does him a disservice and prevents us from really understanding what is actually happening in the American Revolution.
And just sticking a little bit with the British perspective, the other thing that I found was really interesting was the press in Britain was pretty divided over the operations in North America. Can you tell us a little bit about the public opinion in Great Britain during the time?
Yeah, William, it's really quite interesting. Not only is the press divided, the press is free. There is virtually no censorship. There's no suppression of bad news. There's no punishment for those who oppose the government or the king personally. It is a very lively, vigorous newspaper world in Britain in the 18th century, the late 18th century, even though literacy is not as high as it is in the colonies, actually. But there are opponents of the government, the ministry they call it, and opponents of George's policy toward the American colonies. Those opponents are a minority in Parliament, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but they are vocal and they are articulate, and they include people like Edmund Burke, one of the great statesmen of the 18th century. They include Chatham William Pitt, who was the prime minister who engineered British victory in the 7 Years' War and built this first British Empire. He is now Lord Chatham. They are opponents of the king's policies, and behind them are a number of newspapers and other organs of public dissent that are noisy right from the get-go. When the war begins in 1775, there are a number of newspapers that are, in their editorial policies and in their coverage, saying, this is a really bad idea. This is foolish. We don't need to be doing this. And that is going to persist all the way until 1783 when the war ends. It's a thorn in the side for King George. It's always easier to have a supine press if you're the guy in charge. But he believes in freedom of the press. He doesn't like it particularly, the way it's practiced. But this is one of the basics of British freedom, of the system that has evolved over 800 years in Britain. And it is part of the landscape of political Britain. Of course, we have taken much of that into our own body politic. We have a robust British press. We have a robust press at the time of the Revolution. It has to be said it's less free than the British press. There is suppression of loyalist newspapers that are supporting the king's policies, just as there is a vigorous, brutal repression of loyalists themselves. So this is part of this very complex human landscape of this thing we call the American Revolution.
And that's actually a perfect going into the next question. Is in the book, you describe it a couple of times as a civil war, what was happening, the Revolutionary War. Can you talk a little bit about the interaction now between the revolutionaries and loyalists and even like the setting up of vigilante committees and this type of thing, almost the internal violence among people in North America?
Yes, and it is violent. Well, in 1775, there are 2.5 million people in the 13 colonies. 500,000 of them are black slaves. They don't get a voice. They don't get a vote, needless to say. But of the other 2 million, of the 2 million whites in those 13 colonies, historians today believe that about 18 to 20% of them were loyalists, meaning that they didn't want to rebel against their king, that they had doubts about the propriety, the sense of armed rebellion against your government. And this is a shifting dynamic. You could be a loyalist one day if the British Army is in your backyard, and then when they leave and the Continental Army is in your backyard, or local militia is pressing you to acknowledge that you will support this rebellion, then you might be neutral, or you might swing to the other side and be a rebel. So it's a difficult thing to get your arms around, because it really does shift and shake a bit. But it has to be said that really from the beginning, there is a civil war quality to the revolution, in which a number of those who are loyalists take up arms. In some cases, they fight in units with British officers, or they fight in units that are under the British Army protection. They fight as adjuncts to them. And we're going to see this intensify as the war goes on. The Civil War quality of the revolution is going to get nastier and nastier. To suppress this kind of loyalist insurgency within the insurgency, the colonies, they will become states in 1776, assume committees of safety, for example. They're called by different names, but they are empowered generally to be agents of repression. And so if you are a Quaker in Philadelphia and you will not swear an oath to support the rebellion, you believe in peaceful means of settling disputes, you will not take up arms, there's a possibility, and it happened a number of times, that you will be arrested and you will be jailed and you will be, in about 20 cases, exiled to remote Virginia. This happens over and over in all of the colonies. In some cases, the treatment of loyalists is really brutal. There are beatings, there's exile, property expropriated. Occasionally, there are executions. In Connecticut, there's an old copper mine that is transformed into a jail, and loyalists who will not swear an oath of loyalty to the revolution are lowered by windlass down 70, 80 feet below ground into these rock-walled cells known simply as hell. It's very harsh treatment. And this is going to go on until 1783.
And you mentioned slavery. Can you expand a little bit on the role that slavery played in bringing the South, the Southern colonies and then states into the fold in the Revolution, and especially after Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, made his announcement in regards to slaves? And then also, it just, to me, it speaks a little bit of kind of the messiness of British strategy in regards to the colonies. So if you could talk about those 2 points, please.
Yes, it's a very interesting aspect of our early history. It's disheartening, needless to say. We have the 500,000 black slaves. They are the bedrock of the economy in the South. In South Carolina, for example, in the low country of South Carolina around Charleston, black slaves are a majority of the population. And the question of what to do with them bedevils both sides from the beginning. Not unlike the way it will bedevil both sides in the Civil War some decades later. The American northern colonies, then the northern states, are moving toward, if not emancipation, a feeling that slavery is not productive economically and it's not justifiable on any kind of humanitarian terms. In the South, they've got their heels dug in. This is a critical part of who we are in the South, and we will do nothing that upsets the right to have slaves work our property, to have chattel. Lord Dunmore he will be the last royal governor of Virginia, and as the revolution begins, Dunmore takes it on himself, without really consulting with London, to offer freedom to any slave belonging to rebels, not to loyalists, and not to Dunmore himself. Dunmore has 57 slaves. He does not free them, but he offers to free any slaves who can get away from their white rebel masters and come and join British forces, and they will be given guns and they'll be given a modicum of training, and they can join the fight. Nothing infuriates white Southern plantation owners more than this gesture by Dunmore, including George Washington, who, it must be said, when he dies at Mount Vernon in December 1799, has more than 300 slaves, and he's got more than 200 during the Revolution. And this infuriating, obstreperous action by Dunmore unites the white Southern planter class and really white Southerners generally in a way that nothing the British has done previously. It unites them in a fury of outrage. These kind of issues are going to persist through the war because, among other things, there's a manpower shortage on both sides. And Washington initially is reluctant to have any blacks in the new army that he's forming. He's outside of Boston in the first year of the conflict, but then he relents, and free blacks are allowed to come in, or slaves whose masters have purchased spots for them. There will be about 5,000 black soldiers who fight for the American cause over the course of the Revolution. Rhode Island has a couple of all-black units with white officers. And there are proposals by a very attractive young lieutenant colonel named John Lawrence from Charleston, South Carolina. His father at one time has been the biggest slave trader in America. And John Lawrence is an abolitionist. He's educated in Switzerland. He knows that slavery is morally indefensible. He proposes that slaves be armed to join the rebel cause, and that they be given their freedom as a consequence of this sacrifice that they're making. South Carolina will not buy it. They absolutely refuse to do it. But this kind of complex dynamic that's going on both sides is part, again, of the landscape of the country at that time and part of the dynamic of the war.
And then there's another character that kind of is woven through the book, is disease, and especially smallpox. And if I remember reading correctly, that there was a start of a smallpox epidemic in different parts of the colonies at that. Can you tell us a little bit how smallpox and typhus and other diseases had an effect on battles and other decisions during this period?
Yeah, well, in a time of COVID-19, we can all have perhaps a little more sympathy for the role that disease can play in our lives. COVID-19 is as awful as it is nothing like smallpox. Smallpox, known as the king of terrors, mortality rate is very high. It's very, very infectious, easily transmitted. From 1775 to 1782, there were 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America, and it's a terrible way to die. There are eruptions on the skin. It can cause you to go blind. The mortality rate is more than 10%. At that point, it was not understood what causes smallpox, the virus that causes smallpox, but there was a recognition that there was a way to fight it off. A kind of an inoculation, not a vaccination, but an inoculation. So, and it's very crude. You make a cut in your arm or on your leg, you take a feather or a straw, you dip it into an active smallpox pustule, you take some of the pus and you put it into that cut on your arm. Sounds awful, doesn't it? And it gives you smallpox. It deliberately inoculates you with smallpox, but almost always at a much less virulent level than if you obtain it naturally. The mortality rate from this kind of inoculation was very small. Washington, who had smallpox as a young man when he went to Barbados, he's got smallpox pox on his face, scars on his face, knows that this disease, not to mention typhus, typhoid, they don't know the difference between them in the 18th century, dysentery. There's a long string of deadly diseases that will debilitate, if not destroy, an army. And this is something that Washington and his British counterparts are constantly aware of. For the Americans, smallpox in the first couple of years of the war is really dreadful. It chews up the army. It kills the American commander in Canada, who's a physician, incidentally, and will not take the inoculation because he just resists it. And he contracts smallpox and has a terrible death. Washington, in the winter of 1776-77, he's in winter quarters after the Battle of Princeton, and he realizes that he's got to have his army inoculated. And so there is a very deliberate, very thorough process of unit by unit inoculating these men. You have to isolate them. It all sounds slightly familiar, doesn't it? They have to basically be isolated for a couple weeks afterward because they are contagious. But once they've gone through this process, they are immune for life. And so he does that. Smallpox never goes away. Smallpox is going to be with both armies throughout the war. There will be outbreaks in cities that are devastating. But for the most part, he's able to neutralize to a large extent that particular disease. Other diseases like dysentery and typhus known as jail fever, it's spread by lice, and jail fever, ship fever, because it's whenever human beings are closely crowded together and there are lice and they transmit this disease. They never are able to eradicate those diseases or even to ensure that there will not be outbreaks that do in fact cause serious military consequences.
All right, so this will be my last question because we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. But I do want to talk now about some of the military operations. And the one that I'm the most fascinated by is the Battle of New York. And okay, I have a bias because I'm a New Yorker, I'm coming from New York, but it also, to me, it has like a little of everything from July 1776, when the statue of King George III is torn down in Bowling Green, to it's a naval amphibious assault. You have a fleet of British battleships in the harbor. Tell us about the Battle of New York, the lead up and some of the consequences of the Battle of New York.
Yeah, well, Washington, after he successfully drives the British out of Boston in March of 1776, by basically encircling them and getting the high ground, and his artillery commander, this 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox, goes hundreds of miles to Ticonderoga and brings back cannon through the snow on sleds. And the British wake up one morning in March 1776, and there are all these big guns basically pointing down their throats in Boston. They evacuate Boston. Washington at that point knows that the war is likely to move to New York. It's the centerpiece of the 13 colonies at that point. And so this long, deadly dance begins. Washington shifts his army to New York. New York is impossible to defend if you don't command the sea, because it's, as you well know, William, it's an archipelago. There's water everywhere. The Royal Navy is the most powerful naval force the world has ever seen. They completely control the waterways of New York after they arrive in midsummer of 1776. And so Washington is really playing a very bad hand. He controls Manhattan. He controls Long Island. The British will land on Long Island in August of 1776 after basing themselves on Staten Island. And the biggest battle of the American Revolution will occur on Long Island in late August of 1776. Washington is outgeneraled. He doesn't see what the British are doing to him. He doesn't see that he's got a weak line that can be outflanked. The British are going to take a march to their right, to the east, around Washington's lines. Washington and his army are going to wake up in the morning and the British are going to be behind them, which is, you never want that when you're a general. And it's a rout. And Washington and the army, there are lots of men killed or captured. They're pushed back to what is now Brooklyn, and then was the little village of Brooklyn. They've got their backs to the East River. It really is very dicey. It looks like it could all end right there. Washington makes an escape across the river, across the East River in the fog to Manhattan, and manages to get away, to fight another day. That said, almost immediately afterwards, the British are going to land again, amphibious operation, this time at Kips Bay. You know where that is. It's kind of midtown Manhattan on the East River, on the east side of Manhattan. Again, the Americans are routed. Again, the British come sweeping through in force, and they're going to, at that point, own everything on Manhattan Island from the north part of what is now Central Park all the way down to the Battery, the very tip, the southern tip of Manhattan Island. There'll be a little skirmish in Harlem Heights. It's not going well for Washington or his army. This is now September. On November 16th, the last toehold that the Americans have on Manhattan Island at Fort Washington. Again, Washington is outgeneraled. He doesn't see the vulnerability of the 3,000 soldiers he has left there. The British under General Howe very deftly surround Fort Washington. There is no escape across the Hudson. Fort Washington is on the west side of Manhattan, up beyond Harlem. And those 3,000 men are killed or captured. It's a catastrophe. And that really is the end of the American contest for New York. The British are going to hold New York until they leave in 1783. It will be their headquarters for the entire war. There are other battles around New York. At that time, there's a battle in White Plains. It's kind of neither side wins. Washington holds his own. Right across the Hudson River at Fort Lee, again, the Americans are surprised and routed and have to flee for their lives. So New York is, in some ways, the nadir. It's the bottom of the emotional roller coaster that is the American Revolution, because the town has been lost. It has become a British stronghold. It has a great port, of course, then and now. It is a bastion for not only the British Army, but for the Royal Navy. And there are great questions at that point. We're talking now about the late fall of 1776, about Washington as a commander-in-chief. Is this guy up to it? Does he know what he's doing? He seems to lose a lot. And there are questions. And that, of course, is going to lead to where we started. That's Trenton and Princeton. Washington is so desperate that he's going to take a big gamble and attack Christmas night, famously, across the Delaware River, because he's really got very little to lose at this point.
It's all so dramatic, and it really jumps off the pages of your book. So I'm going to hand it over to Corette. She's going to ask you the questions from the audience. But before we get to the audience questions, Corette is going to announce our selected student question from a question submitted over the week by students. So thank you so much, Mr. Atkinson, and I'm going to hand you over to the good hands of Corette.
Thank you, William.
Hello. So before we get to the audience question, this week's selected student question is from Helena from Omaha Central High School. Congratulations, Elena, and thank you so much for your wonderful question. And that question is, do you think that the war or the creation of the U.S. as a whole would have been different if Thomas Gage had not downplayed to Parliament how widespread the feelings of unrest were, instead of saying that it was confined to Boston?
Yeah, well, thanks for that good, sophisticated question, Elena, and hi to my friends in Omaha. You know, Thomas Gage was the British commander in North America. He was very experienced. He'd spent a lot of time in North America. He'd married an American, in fact. And he did downplay the threat of the rebellion on 1774 and on into early 1775. But the longer he's in Boston, which is where his headquarters was, and the more things develop, the more he recognizes that he has misjudged the depth and breadth of the rebellion. And he does tell his political masters and military masters in London in the winter of 1774-75, we got a big problem here. I don't have enough troops. I need a lot more troops. I need more ships. The rebellion looks as though it's got some purchase outside of New England. I'm really worried about it. So had he recognized earlier that this was a forest fire and not just a little brush fire, it's possible that in London they would have given him more men and so on. I don't think it would have fundamentally changed the outcome of either the war or in the short term. I don't think it really would have affected the way things develop, where he fights the rebels at the beginning in Lexington and Concord, and then ends up being essentially surrounded in Boston. I think those were foreordained, given the way things were developing politically.
All right, awesome. The next question is from Alf from Tucson, and he asks, to what extent did Americans' experience in the French and Indian War, particularly George Washington's, influence the Continental Army strategy and tactics during the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Al. Thanks for that. Well, we, of course, fought with the British. We were British in the French and Indian War, and we were significant contributors to the British cause against the French and their Indian allies, particularly fighting in Canada. Now, Washington was a provincial militia colonel for 5 years in Virginia. He had a fair amount of combat experience, almost all of it bad. He was with his commanding general when they were ambushed near present-day Pittsburgh. That commander, General Braddock, was killed. Many of the British soldiers with General Braddock were killed or captured, in some cases brutally killed. Washington had bullets through his uniform, through his hat. His experience in the French and Indian War was really significant in a variety of ways, but he then goes out of uniform for 16 years. He leaves service as a colonel. He goes back to being a gentleman planter. He works on Mount Vernon. He gets married. He marries the richest widow in Virginia, Martha Custis. And so when he comes back into uniform in 1775 as the commander of the new Continental Army, he knows about small-scale fighting. He knows about fighting on the frontier. There's a lot he does not know. He does not know about artillery. He doesn't know about cavalry. He doesn't know about continental logistics and so on. So he's going to have to learn all of that. Now, the officers serving under him in many cases do have combat experience as a consequence of service in the French and Indian War. There's a lot of them who have fought in Canada. And that's important because not only have they heard the sound of gunfire, of shots fired in anger, but they've, in many cases, had experience leading men, small unit actions. And this is important. In some cases, they are more experienced than their British counterparts in that they've actually seen combat. So all of that plays into this Continental Army that's going to come into being.
The next question is from George. He asks, what are the chief elements of myth that surround the common understanding of the American Revolution and how it was fought?
Yeah, well, there's so many myths, George. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, we touched on one of them earlier, and that is that the British were buffoons led by a buffoon in King George III, that they had only ill will and no real rationale for waging war, for trying to prevent us from seceding from the British Empire. I think the mythology about who the British were and why they fought persists to this day. There are lots of myths about the capability of the Americans. For example, the notion that the war was mostly fought by yeoman farmers who rushed in to take the musket off of the mantelpiece and out in defense of freedom, That's mostly mythical. By the time we get into just the second or third year of the Revolution, the typical American soldier is not a yeoman farmer who's left his farm temporarily. They're often immigrants, many of them from Ireland. They're often indigents, meaning they're broke. They have pretty shallow roots in the community. They did not come over on the Mayflower. They may have come over last year on a packet ship from Dublin or from Liverpool. So our fundamental notion of who these men were, and they were all men at that time, fighting for our freedom are largely wrong, I think. The notion that George Washington could do no wrong is completely wrong. He's not a great field marshal. He makes many mistakes. I touched on a couple of them earlier when we were talking about New York. So there are real deficiencies in Washington as a field commander. Now, he's got extraordinary strengths in many ways, and he learns as he goes along, and I'm a big admirer of him. But seeing him as a whole is important. And then we touched on another aspect of it. Let's remember there were 500,000 enslaved Americans who could not participate in any meaningful way in the decision of whether or not we were going to be part of the British Empire, whether we were going to be independent. Either way, they were likely to remain slaves. And I think understanding that human terrain that includes the fact that 1 in 5 of us were essentially in shackles is very important, even as we celebrate the revolutionary generation.
Next question is from Joseph from Texas, and he says, I have bought the book and I'm looking forward to reading it. And since you're continuing the series, including the British perspective, will you be reviewing the nature of the revolution as a world war, with the inclusion of the French and Spanish and the necessity of protecting the economy of the sugar islands as being more important to the empire than the American colonies?
Yes, well, you're obviously well-read. That's another sophisticated question. Of course, this becomes a world war in volume 2, which I'm researching hammer and tongs now, and have been hard at it for about 1.5 years now. The French are going to come into the war, not because King Louis believes that democracy is an appropriate way to run a country, but because he wants to stick it to the British. And after the Battle of Saratoga, which is September and October of 1777, the French are going to make the calculated judgment that helping the American colonies, not only surreptitiously, which they've been doing already by giving us some money and shipping arms secretly, but by openly supporting us with men, materiel, the French Navy, is in their best interest. And at that point, it begins to become, as you say, a world war. The Spanish, their Bourbon allies, are going to come in also, not on behalf of the Americans, but to help their French brothers. They're going to come into the war, and that's important because they have also a large navy. The Dutch are eventually going to come into the war. So it becomes a world war, and you're right, the sugar islands are more important to the British economy than anything North American can offer them. It's the source of great wealth for Britain. It's a source of great wealth for a number of British families that are politically powerful. And the fight in America, in the 13 states, is almost a sideshow by the time we get to 1778. The French and the Spanish put together a very large armada, and they plan in 1779 to invade England. They're off the coast of England. It is a repeat of the Spanish Armada of 1588. Like that first armada, this one doesn't go very well for the invaders either, but that gives you a sense of the drama and the shift of the center of gravity for the war. a lot of the combat takes place away from our shores. There's still a lot that happens here, especially in the American South after 1778. And of course, Yorktown in Virginia marks the end of the most serious combat, although the war doesn't end for another 2 years after that. But it does become a much bigger thing. And for Britain, it becomes even more critical as a threat to their empire, because now they're not just fighting a rebellion against these obstreperous 2.5 million American colonists. Now they're basically fighting the world. They have no allies, incidentally. And the pain of not having allies is shown full force in Britain in the 18th century.
This next question is from Judith. She says, the current British secondary education system barely mentions our revolution, while Americans are fascinated. How does this difference in perspective affect our current international relations with the UK?
Well, of course, the British, they're not thrilled to dwell on the untidiness and unpleasantness that occurred in the American Revolution. It's a war they lost. It was painful. It was expensive. There were a lot of men who died. Their empire shrunk, as I mentioned earlier. George III is held in bad odor generally. He's that king who lost the war. There's been somewhat of a resurgence in his reputation, I have to say, over the last generation or so. But they don't look at the American Revolution as we Americans look at the Revolution, for obvious reasons. How has it affected our relationship with them? How has it affected today? I mean, I think that there's a widespread belief sometimes that the special relationship, as it's called, between the United States and Britain has been around basically since the Revolution ended. And that's not true. It's really a product of World War II. The British were our hereditary enemies. And it's important to remember we fight them again in the War of 1812, which again is pretty nasty stuff. And we don't really trust them through most of the 19th century. There's great concern they're going to intervene in the Civil War on behalf of the South. So the special relationship is a product partly of Winston Churchill's imagination in World War II, partly as a consequence of being thrown together in World War II to help defend democracy and the Western democracies generally. I think that now, 240 years after the American Revolution, the fact that most British school children are not taught much about the Revolution probably doesn't affect our bilateral relationship. The fact that we are all English speaking, at least we speak some mongrel variation of English, I think has always made available an emotional connection between the two peoples. But as we move further into the 21st century, that relationship has been strained, as our relationship with most of our close allies has been strained. And it's important for all of us to try to build them back. They are our dearest friends in many respects. And it's important that we rebuild that relationship and that we cherish it.
Erin from New Jersey asks, is there a primary document you think teachers can use to give a perspective of the British that represents either the government or an average British soldier fighting in the colonies?
Well, it's hard to put a finger on just one document. The papers of King George can be accessed. The Queen owns the papers of the four men named George who became king, including George III, who was king for 60 years, as I mentioned, and they're digitizing. And the Georgian Papers program, and if you just do a little trawling in George's papers, you can get a feel for his anxieties, his ambitions. You can help to eliminate the caricature quality of George that we Americans often have. You see in the papers from individual officers who are fighting in the Revolution, there's often a sneering contempt for the Americans. They think very little of us, either as individuals or as fighters. This changes a bit over time. The more insightful of them begin to recognize that they've really got a war on their hands. But for the most part, they have an upper class sneering contempt for Americans. So if you look in the papers, there's a British officer named Robertson who's on General Howe's staff. You can find some of this, and you can see how they are underestimating the Americans from the beginning. That's a problem. You don't want to underestimate your adversaries. And Gilder Lehrman has wonderful materials available. If you go through them, I think they will help to pinpoint some things that might be useful to you in this regard.
This question is from Eric, who is from Alexandria, Virginia, and he says, I enjoyed your book tremendously, and thanks for writing it. And he says, one of the many things that impressed him was your emphasis on the difficulties 18th century armies faced, especially diseases like smallpox. Commanders could make all kinds of ambitious plans, but keeping armies and navies functioning at all seemed barely possible. How was that? How did they?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, Eric. You're not far from me. I'm in Washington. You're in Alexandria. You know, the disease issue we talked about earlier with smallpox and typhus and typhoid and dysentery and so on. And these are dreadful diseases that can affect military operations and will end up killing more Americans than bullets or cannonballs. The issue for the British in particular is that they are 3,000 miles from home. And there had been a presumption that they would be able to, at least in part, live off the land as they conducted their military campaigns. And that they would not have to have all of the food, all of the clothing, all of the ammunition, all of the things that you need to outfit and run an army, that it wouldn't all have to come from the home islands. Well, they quickly found out that that was a mistake, that they could not, in fact, live off the land, that there was very little available to them here for a couple of reasons. One, every time they venture outside of Boston or New York or the enclaves where they are strong, they get ambushed. And there is a perpetual running gun battle going on every time they go out to try to collect wheat or collect livestock to feed their armies. They're able to do it to some extent, but there's pain in it. It's very, very difficult. Also, as they're shipping things across the North Atlantic, 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail, they quickly realize, and they know it before the war begins intellectually, but now they know it in practice, that this is really hard. So there are dozens of ships, store ships, that are carrying provisions to that besieged army in Boston, sent across the North Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, the first winter of the war, and almost none of them get there. They are ambushed and taken by rebel marauders, or they're blown by North Atlantic winter storms to the West Indies. It happens a lot. They end up in Antigua by the dozen, or they're blown all the way back to Britain. So you can imagine if you're General Howe's quartermaster, or General Clinton's quartermaster, these are the British commanders for most of the war, trying to anticipate, when I'm going to get the food that I need to feed my army and to feed all the refugees I'm responsible for and the loyalists who are with me in New York or Philadelphia, when I'm going to have enough munitions, when I'm going to be able to replace the tattered uniforms that my soldiers have worn out now. This is a perpetual problem for the British. Waging expeditionary warfare is difficult in the 21st century in Iraq or Afghanistan, even when you've got all the resources that we've got. It's really difficult in the 18th century, in the age of sail, where you're trying to do it across 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic.
So this question will be our final question. Our time is quickly coming to an end. And this question is from Stephen from Shelby, North Carolina. He says, the American Revolution has been a focus of so many historians, biographers, and is such a huge part of American culture. How difficult was it to develop a new and comprehensive perspective of the revolution and its participants?
Yeah, good question, Stephen. All the questions have been terrific, actually. Thank you for thinking about it and for posing these questions, which helped me to think it through. When I started working in 1998 on World War II, and I was told, there have been 60,000 books, literally, on World War II. What are you going to bring to this conversation that's new? My premise then, and it's still my premise, is that great events in our history, just like great men and great women, are bottomless. People will be writing books about Abraham Lincoln 500 years from now. World War II is bottomless. There's more to write. There will always be more to write. The American Revolution falls into the same category. If you're an archive rat like I am, there's always more to discover in archives. There's always a way to tell the story, if you can tell it as the amazing tale that it is, that brings it to an audience in a way that they may not have quite heard before. My ambition, as I've mentioned, is to show the war comprehensively from both sides. I believe, having written about war my entire life, first as a journalist and then as an author, I believe that the emotional resonance of war is profound because it's about young men dying young. That in and of itself is a profoundly emotional thing. And I don't shy away from it. I don't shy away from the brutality of war. The American Revolution is a brutal, bloody, nasty thing. Both between us and the British and between us and us, the Civil War capacities that I've talked about. And reminding readers today of that is important. I think reminding readers today of where we came from, what our forebears were willing to die for, reminding them what they were willing to sacrifice, reminding them that their story, their fight remains our story and our fight. The things they were willing to die for are things that today we should still hold dear, and we should not forget it. We should be reminded of it at every turn, because it's who we are, it's how we're going to continue to be the great people that we are. And if we let it slip away, then we're in trouble. We're really in trouble. So my ambition has been to take this magnificent story and to tell it in a way that even you who are well-read in the history of the early history of the American Republic, haven't quite heard before.
Well, Mr. Atkinson, I don't think we can agree more with that sentiment, and thank you so much. And thank you, Corette, for corralling all those great questions. We have almost 100 questions asked. But before I let everybody go, I'm going to share my screen one more time. All right. And make just a couple of quick announcements. So on the 7th of October, I hope you guys can all join us for a special virtual event celebrating many of you out there in our audience who are teachers. Lin-Manuel Miranda will present the 2020 National History Teacher of the Year Award, and we'll hear from historians, teachers, and students about the profound and lasting influence teachers have had on their lives. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and email events@gilderlehrman.org. Also, if you're interested in getting any awesome historical swag, you can go to the Gilder Lehrman Institute's online gift shop, gligiftshop.com, and it has a whole bunch of fantastic different things from mugs, posters, and tote bags with images from the Gilder Lehrman's collection. And, you know, this week was our first week for middle and high school students to submit questions. We're going to be continuing this on through the month of October. So students, please go ahead and start submitting questions. Teachers, please go ahead and make your students submit questions for the book breaks. So what's coming up next? Well, first, I cannot highly recommend enough that you all go out and purchase The British Are Coming from Bookshop, the Gilder Lehrman page of bookshop.org. And I definitely, speaking for myself and speaking for probably many of you out there, we cannot wait for the second part of this fantastic trilogy to come out. But if you do purchase this first part of this trilogy on bookshop.org, not only do you help support the Gilder Lehrman Institute, you also help support independent bookshops around the country as well, and that is incredibly important at this time. I hope that you'll be able to join us next Sunday on October 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be joined by Harold Holzer and his new book, The Presidents versus the Press. Very, very timely. Also, the following Thursday, join us for Inside the Vault on the 15th of October at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and this will be featuring items from the women's suffrage movement, including a note by Susan B. Anthony on the progress of suffrage. And if you're interested in finding out anything more about all the awesome programs and different resources from the Gilder Lehrman Institute, please head over to gilderlehrman.org. So again, a huge thank you, Mr. Atkinson, for writing this fantastic book, this great conversation, and answering all these wonderful questions. Corrette, a big thank you to you again for corralling all those fantastic questions. And I know many of you didn't get to have your questions asked here on the program, but please go out and purchase the books. It is jam-packed with so much fabulous information. And you, our audience, as always, we're so appreciative of you joining us here on Book Breaks, and hope that you'll continue to join us for future programs. So we're all gonna log off here. I'll leave this screen up for a minute or so, but please remember all the links that were shared in the chat will be sent in the follow-up email. So you don't have to worry about if you don't get any of this information down here. It will all be in that follow-up email. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic Sunday afternoon.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Corette. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you all.